The wind made no sound through the ruined huts, but her breath did, steady as coals, quiet as revenge. Braxton Hollow felt the silence first. It was a physical thing, a pressure against his eardrums where the familiar shriek of the high plains wind ought to be. He'd ridden for a week with that sound, the keening lament of a landscape that wanted him gone, and now, here, in the one place he deserved its full fury, there was nothing. The air was a held breath, brittle and thin in his ravaged lungs. Each inhalation was a draught of powdered charcoal, a memory of smoke so old it had lost its anger and settled into a fine gray dust that coated everything. His horse, a gaunt roan mare with ribs like barrel staves, took a hesitant step, its hoof fall a dull thud in the profound stillness. The sound was obscene, an intrusion. Braxton swayed in the saddle, a wave of dizziness washing over him, hot and foul. The consumption was deep in him now, a gnawing beast in his chest that fed on his breath and his strength, leaving him hollowed out, a shell of the man who had once ridden this same path with a rifle across his lap and righteousness like a torch in his heart. The irony was a bitter taste on his tongue, metallic as old blood. He had come back to the place he'd helped burn, carrying his own slow fire within him. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the ashen soil. His legs, thin as kindling, trembled with the effort. He leaned against the mare's warm, dusty flank, the rasp of his own breathing loud enough to be a shout. One breath, a wet, tearing sound. 2, a shuddering pause. 3, a cough that started deep in his belly and tore its way up his throat, a hook ripping through rotten cloth. He doubled over, spitting a clot of pink-tinged phlegm onto the gray earth. The color was shocking, a smear of life in a world of monochrome death. He stared at it, mesmerized by the proof of his own decay. This was it. This was the place. The end of the trail. The village was a skeleton picked clean by sun and time. Blackened beams clawed at the empty sky like scorched fingers. The circular foundations of the huts were still visible, stone rings filled with a decade of dust and dead weeds. There was no sign of the life that had once pulsed here, no shard of pottery, no scrap of woven cloth. The scouring had been absolute. Marshal Thorne had been proud of that. A clean slate, he'd called it, his voice ringing with the certainty of a man who believed the world could be wiped clean like a bar top. Braxton, then a deputy barely 20 years old, had believed him. He'd held his torch high and his questions low. He coughed again, a shallower, weaker tremor this time, and straightened up, his hand leaving a sweaty patch on the mare's hide. He'd come to give the ghosts what was left of him. It wasn't much. A sack of bones, a chest full of fire, and a soul so worn and frayed it was little more than a whisper. He'd expected to find only their silence, their unseen judgment. He'd planned to lie down in the center of the ruins, in the great circle where the council fire once burned, and let the consumption take the last of his air. A quiet, fitting end, an apology to the dust. But the silence wasn't empty. He felt it now, not just a lack of sound, but a presence within it, a focus. It was the feeling of being watched, but not by the dead. The dead were a multitude, a diffuse pressure of memory. This was singular, sharp. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the skeletal remains of the village, and saw her. She was standing in the dark doorway of what must have been the largest hut, the one belonging to the elder. She was a slip of a thing, maybe 12. Maybe older. Time had a different way of marking people who had lived through fire. She wore a simple shift the color of buckskin, and her bare feet were gray with the same ash that covered the ground, as if she had grown from it. Her face was still, a mask of calm, and her hair, black as a starless night, was unbound, falling straight and heavy past her shoulders. It was her eyes that held him. They were dark, so dark they seemed to drink the thin light, and they did not blink. Within their depths, something shifted and swirled, not a reflection, but an internal motion, like smoke trapped behind glass. Smoke. The thought snagged in his mind. Her eyes were full of smoke. She was not surprised to see him. There was no fear in her posture, no curiosity. There was only a profound and ancient stillness, the stillness of a stone at the bottom of a river. She knew. He felt the certainty of it settle over him, colder and heavier than the coming night. She knew who he was. He took a stumbling step toward her, his hand falling away from the mare. The horse, sensing the shift, took a nervous step back, the jingle of its harness a brief, sharp sound that died instantly. Braxton's mouth was dry, his tongue a piece of wood. The words he had rehearsed for the ghosts, the confession he had carried across the plains, turned to ash in his throat. He began, and the word dissolved into another racking cough. He bent over, bracing his hands on his knees, his body convulsing. The fit was longer this time, a brutal storm that left him gasping, dizzy, with tears of pain streaming from his eyes. When he could finally draw a ragged breath, he looked up. She had not moved. Her smoky eyes were still fixed on him, unwavering. And then she spoke. Her voice was not a child's voice. It was low and raspy, yet carried without effort through the dead air. It sounded like the whisper of embers, the hiss of water on hot stones. It was the sound of a voice that had been remade by fire. "You have the marshal's dust on you," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the ground beneath her feet. It never washes off. Braxton's blood went cold. 10 years. 10 years he had wandered, trying to scour the memory of Thorn, of the raid, of the smell of burning pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet. He had washed himself in rivers, abraded his skin with sand, drowned himself in cheap whiskey, but she saw it. A child who could not possibly have remembered. She saw the stain on his soul. Who are you?" he whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. She tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "I am the one who stayed," she said. "I keep the quiet now." She took a step out of the doorway, into the fading light. "My name is Osha." The name meant nothing to him, and yet it felt familiar like a word heard in a dream. Osha. Ash. "I came here," he started, trying to find his purpose again. "I came to die," she finished for him. Again, no judgment, just a fact. Many things die here. The wind, the light, memories when they grow tired. She looked him over, her gaze lingering on his chest, as if she could see the disease festering within. "Your fire is almost out." The words, so simple, so true, broke something inside him. The carefully constructed wall of resolve he had built for this final pilgrimage crumbled into dust. He was not a stoic penitent. He was a dying, terrified man. He sank to his knees in the ash, the sharp edges of buried stones digging into his flesh. "Yes," he wept, the sound ugly and torn. "Yes, I am dying. I deserve it." He looked up at her, his face slick with tears and sweat. The plea that had been a silent scream in his heart for a decade finally clawed its way out. "Punish me." He expected her to recoil, to show fear or anger. He wanted her to. He wanted her to scream, to throw stones, to call down the vengeance of her slaughtered people upon his head. It would be a relief, a clean, sharp pain to cauterize the festering wound of his guilt. Osha did none of those things. She simply watched him, her expression unchanging. "Punishment is a mercy," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It is an ending. You have not earned an ending yet." "What do you want from me?" he cried, his voice cracking. "Take my horse. Take what little I have. Let me lie here. Let it be over." "The dead do not want your horse," she said, her gaze drifting past him to the anxious mare. "They do not want your silver or your worn-out boots. They do not even want your life. It is too small a thing." She walked toward him then, her steps silent on the ashen ground. She moved with a grace that did not belong in this desolate place, a ghost of a dance. She stopped a few feet from where he knelt, a small, unmovable pillar against the vast, empty horizon. "They want to be remembered," she said, her smoky eyes seeming to look through him, into the hollow space in his chest. "And you will be the one to help them remember." Braxton stared at her, uncomprehending. "How? I am a killer, a destroyer." "Yes," she agreed, the word soft as falling soot. "You are the wound. The memory of the knife is sharpest in the wound. The story begins where you stand." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settled deep into Braxton's bones. He was trapped, not by bars or ropes, but by a child's quiet words and the weight of 100 unseen eyes. He had ridden into the ghost village to die, to find an end to his suffering. But the girl with smoke in her eyes had a different plan for him. His ordeal was not over. It was just beginning. The light bled from the sky, the horizon turning a bruised purple. The ruins became stark black shapes against the fading glow. The silence deepened, and in that silence, Braxton began to feel them. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a change in the texture of the air, a thickening. It was the feeling of a room filling with people, their collective presence pressing in on him. The ghosts were gathering. They had come not to haunt, but to watch. Osha stood before him, her small form immense in the twilight. "Get up, Braxton Hollow," she commanded, her voice no longer a whisper, but a quiet authority that vibrated in the ground. "The night is for work. The stones are cold." He did not know what she meant, but the command was absolute. He was a deputy again, taking orders. But this time, the orders came not from a marshal with a silver star, but from a child with ghosts at her back. He pushed himself up, his joints screaming in protest, his breath catching in his chest. He stood, swaying, caked in the dust of the lives he had helped turn to ash, and waited for her to tell him what to do. There would be no easy death for him here. He would have to earn it, breath by painful breath, memory by terrible memory. He was the guest of honor at a funeral 10 years in the making. His own. "The first memory is of the water," Osha said, her voice pulling him from the daze of his exhaustion. She turned and began to walk, not toward the center of the village, but away from it, toward the dry, cracked bed of what must have once been a creek. He had no choice but to follow. His body was a cage of pain, but his will was no longer his own. He was an instrument, and she was the one who would play the song. He stumbled after her, his boots scuffing through the gray dust. The mare, untethered, followed at a distance, a spectral shadow in the gloaming. The ghosts trailed behind them, a silent procession. He could feel their cool presence at his back, on his neck, 1,000 unshed tears in the air. He did not dare look back. He kept his eyes on the small, straight back of the girl in front of him. They reached the creek bed, a wide, shallow scar in the earth littered with smooth, pale stones. They gleamed faintly in the starlight, like polished bones. "Here," Osha said, stopping. She pointed to a large, flat stone near the bank. This was Leon's washing stone. She would kneel here, and her songs would follow the water downstream. She looked at Braxton, her smoky eyes pinning him in place. "The water is gone. The songs are gone. But the stone remembers." Braxton stared at the rock. It was just a rock, cold, inert. What do you want me to do?" "Kneel," she said. He obeyed without question, his knees cracking as he lowered himself onto the hard, unforgiving ground beside the stone. The position was achingly familiar. It was the posture of prayer, of subjugation. "Place your hands on it," she commanded. He hesitated, his hands trembling. He had used these hands to carry a torch. He had used them to hold a rifle, its stock warm and solid against his shoulder as the first hut caught fire. He had kept them clean, a deputy's pride, while the world around him turned to filth and ash. Now they were thin and pale, the knuckles swollen, the nails blue-tinged. He slowly reached out and laid them flat on the surface of the stone. It was cold. Not just the passive cold of rock, but a deep, biting cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from his flesh, pulling it down into the earth. It felt like plunging his hands into a frozen river. A gasp escaped his lips, and he tried to pull back, but Osha's voice stopped him. "Close your eyes, Braxton Hollow, and listen." He closed his eyes. The world dissolved into the red-black tapestry of the inside of his eyelids and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Listen to what? The silence? The pounding of his own sick heart? "Listen past the blood in your ears," Osha's voice murmured, seeming to come from all around him now. "Listen past the fire in your lungs. Listen to the stone." He tried. He forced his breathing to slow, fighting the urge to cough. He focused on the chilling cold spreading up his arms, a numbness that was almost a relief. And then, faintly, he heard it. It wasn't a sound that entered his ears. It was a vibration, a resonance that traveled from the stone, through his hands, up his arms, and into the hollow of his skull. A hum, low and gentle, the sound of a woman's voice, singing a wordless melody. His eyes snapped open. "You were a boy," a voice said inside his head. It was not Osha's voice. It was a woman's, gentle and melodic, the voice of the humming. It wasn't an accusation. It was a sad, simple truth. "You were a boy, and you followed a man who hated the sound of our songs." Braxton wrenched his hands from the stone as if it had burned him. He scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was that? Who was that? Osha looked down at him, her face impassive in the moonlight. That was Leon. She was the first to fall. The marshal did not like her singing. He remembered. He remembered with a clarity that stole his breath. Marshal Thorne, his face a mask of grim purpose, striding toward a woman who stood by the creek, who had not run, who had simply turned to face them, her voice rising in a strange, defiant song. He remembered Thorne raising his pistol. He remembered the flat, ugly crack of the shot and how the song had been cut off, replaced by the sudden, shocking silence that had preceded the screaming. Braxton had stood there, his torch flickering, and done nothing. He was a boy. He was a boy following orders. The excuse felt like sand in his mouth. She spoke to me, he stammered, staring at his hands. The stone remembers her, Osha said. You have made the memory speak. She turned away from the creek bed and started back toward the ruins. There is more work. The night is long. He was trembling uncontrollably, the cold from the stone now deep inside him, a shard of ice lodged next to the fire in his lungs. He had wanted punishment. He was beginning to understand what that meant. It wasn't the swift justice of a rope or a bullet. It was this. It was being forced to listen to the whispers of the people he had helped silence. He followed her back to the center of the village, to the wide, barren circle where the great fire had been. The ghosts were thicker here, a silent, waiting crowd. He could almost see the impressions they left in the air, the outlines of shoulders, the shapes of heads turned toward him. Osha stopped in the very center. This was the heart of our people, she said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. Here, the stories were told. Here, the agreements were made. Here, the children were named. She gestured to the ground. The earth here is tired. It has slept for 10 years under a blanket of ash. You will wake it up. How? He asked, his voice a dry rasp. You will clear the circle, she said, pointing to the ring of foundation stones that marked its edge. From this spot to the stones, every weed, every loose pebble, every trace of the gray dust. You will make it clean. He stared at the vast circle, perhaps 50 feet across. It was an impossible task for a healthy man, let alone him. I can't, he whispered. I don't have the strength. Lian had the strength to sing as she died, Osha replied, her voice flat. Taro had the strength to shield his son. Find your strength, Braxton Hollow. She left him then, melting back into the shadows of the ruined elder's hut, leaving him alone in the center of the circle with the silent, watching dead. He stood there for a long time, the starlight casting his long, skeletal shadow on the ground. Despair washed over him, a cold, dark tide. He could just lie down. He could refuse. He could let the consumption win here and now. But the memory of the voice from the stone, "You were a boy," echoed in his mind. It was not forgiveness. It was understanding. And that was so much worse. It stripped him of his monstrousness and left him with nothing but his own pathetic human failure. He sank to his knees again, not in supplication this time, but in resignation. His hands were raw from the cold of the washing stone. He looked at them, then at the ground. A single, stubborn weed grew near his knee, its leaves pale and ghostly in the moonlight. With a groan of effort, he reached out and pulled it. The roots came free with a soft, tearing sound. He tossed it aside, outside the unseen line she had drawn. One weed. He crawled forward and found another, then a small, sharp-edged stone that he palmed and threw into the darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps. A fit of coughing seized him, and he collapsed onto his side, his body shaking. The ghosts watched. He could feel their patience. They had all the time in the world. He had only what was left of the night. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself back up. He began to clear the circle. He used his bare hands, his fingers digging into the compacted ash and earth, scraping, pulling, piling the debris behind him. It was mindless, grueling work. His back ached. His lungs burned. The skin on his fingertips split open, and he left small, dark smears of his blood in the gray dust. And as he worked, the memories came. Not from the stones this time, but from inside him. The raid wasn't a blur of smoke and shouting anymore. It was a series of sharp, terrible vignettes. He remembered the smell of the weaving hut catching fire, the scent of burning wool and dye. He remembered the sound of the loom crashing to the floor, a sound like a great beast groaning in its death throes. He remembered a young man, not much older than himself, who stood in the path of the deputies, holding nothing but a ceremonial wooden spear. He remembered how the man had looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of pitying contempt, just before Marshal Thorne rode him down. He remembered the shattering of pottery, beautiful, intricate things with swirling patterns, crushed under the deputy's heavy boots. Each memory was a turn of the knife in his gut. He worked on, fueled by the pain, by the guilt. He scraped and clawed at the earth as if he could scrape away the stain on his own soul. The moon climbed high into the sky, a cold, silver eye, watching his penance. The circle began to grow, a patch of dark, clean earth spreading out from the center. Hours passed. His movements became slow, automatic. He was beyond exhaustion, operating in a trance of pain and memory. At some point, he became aware of a new presence. He looked up, his vision blurry. Osha was standing at the edge of the cleared circle, holding a wooden bowl. She walked to him and knelt, offering it. "Drink," she said. He stared at the bowl. It contained water. Clear, clean water. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was. His throat was a desert. He reached for it with his bloody, trembling hands and drank. The water was cool and sweet. It was the most profound relief he had ever known. He drank it all, the last drops spilling down his chin. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice thick with gratitude. "It is Lian's water," she said. "From a deep spring she showed me. It remembers her songs. He looked at the empty bowl, then at her. Her face was unreadable in the dark, but he felt a shift in the air. The judgment was still there, but it was accompanied by something else, something that felt almost like pity. "The dawn is coming," she said, taking the bowl back. "You have done enough. For now." He looked at the circle. He had cleared maybe a third of it. It looked impossibly large. He had poured all his remaining strength into the task, and it was not even half done. "Rest," she said. "The stones are not ready for you yet." He collapsed onto the patch of earth he had just cleared. It was cool and firm beneath him. He was too tired to cough. He closed his eyes, and the darkness that took him was not the gentle mercy of sleep, but a bottomless, dreamless void. His last conscious thought was that the ground, the very earth of this village, smelled of sorrow and time. And for the first time in 10 years, he did not dream of fire. He dreamed of nothing at all. He awoke to gray light and a cough that felt like it was tearing his lungs from his chest. He was on his back, staring up at a sky the color of dishwater. A fine mist hung in the air, clinging to the blackened beams of the huts and making the ground damp. The world was quiet, muffled. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the night's labor. His hands were a mess of dried blood and dirt, the knuckles swollen and stiff. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he pushed himself into a sitting position. He was in the circle. The patch of cleared earth around him seemed smaller in the daylight. Beyond it, the gray ash stretched away, a testament to his failure. Osha was there, tending a small, smokeless fire near the elder's hut. The scent of something savory and herbal reached him, making his empty stomach clench. He watched her for a moment. She moved with an economy of motion, her small hands deft and sure. She was a child playing house in the ruins of her world, but there was no playfulness in her. She was performing a ritual as old as the stones around them. She seemed to feel his gaze and looked over at him. "The day is for breathing," she said. "The night is for work." She brought him another bowl, this one filled with a thin, hot broth. It was made from wild greens and perhaps some kind of root. It tasted of the earth, bitter and nourishing. He drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through his chest, a temporary truce with the fire that lived there. He didn't deserve this kindness. That was the point. The punishment was not in the cruelty, but in the moments of care that highlighted his own monstrousness. Each sip was an accusation. He spent the day in a state of near torpor. He sat in the circle, the damp cold of the earth seeping into him. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter in the daylight, their presence a low hum at the edge of his hearing. He watched Osha as she moved through the village. She gathered herbs from the tenacious plants that grew in the shadow of the ruins. She fetched water from her hidden spring. She mended a tear in her buckskin shift with a bone needle and thread made from sinew. She was tending the embers of a life that should have been extinguished. He tried to speak to her once, to ask about her family, about how she had survived. "My name is Braxton," he started, his voice a hoarse croak. "I know," she said, without looking up from her work. "I was there, that night. I know. Did you see me?" She finally stopped her work and looked at him. Her smoky eyes were clear in the gray light, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something beyond her preternatural calm. It was a deep, ancient sorrow. "I saw all of you," she said, her voice low. "You were a river of fire and shouting. You moved as one body. To see one of you is to see you all." The words erased him, stripped him of his individuality. He was not Braxton Hollow, the deputy who had made a mistake. He was just a part of the mob, a single drop in the river of fire. His personal guilt was meaningless, subsumed into a larger, collective crime. "My mother hid me in the cold pantry, under the floor of our hut," she continued, her voice becoming distant, as if she were reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. It was dug into the earth. I listened to the ground. I felt the running, the falling. I felt the heat of the roofs as they collapsed. I smelled the smoke. When I came out, the moon was up, and the village was silent. The silence was new. I had never heard it before. She fell silent, her gaze turned inward. Braxton had no words. An apology would be an insult, an explanation, a blasphemy. He could only sit there, the witness to her testimony, the living embodiment of the catastrophe she described. When dusk began to fall again, she came to him. "It is time," she said. "The stones are waiting." The work resumed, the same grueling, repetitive task, kneeling, crawling, scraping away the ash with his raw hands. But tonight, it was different. His body was weaker, the coughing fits more frequent and more violent. Yet his mind was clearer. He was not just clearing dirt. He was preparing a sacred space. He was an acolyte, performing a rite he did not understand. As he worked, a new set of memories rose, unbidden, not of the raid itself, but of the days leading up to it, the talk in the town, fueled by Marshal Thorne's grim pronouncements. Savages, Thorne had called them, squatters on land that isn't theirs. He'd spoken of their strange religion, their refusal to bow to the authority of the territorial governor. He'd made them seem alien, less than human. It had been so easy to believe him. The fear of the unknown was a powerful poison. Braxton remembered polishing his boots, shining his star, feeling a sense of pride, of purpose. He was bringing order to a lawless frontier. He was on the side of progress, of civilization. The memory made him want to vomit. He retched, but only a thin, bitter bile came up. Sometime deep in the night, he felt a presence beside him. It was Osha. She knelt in the dirt next to him, her small hands beginning to scrape at the ash. She did not speak. They worked side by side in silence, two figures under the vast, star-dusted sky, one clearing the ground in penance, the other in remembrance. Her presence did not lessen his burden, but it changed its nature. He was no longer alone in his labor. He was a participant in her ritual. They finished the circle just before the moon set. It was a perfect, dark disk of clean-swept earth, stark against the gray ash of the village. Braxton lay on his back at the edge of it, utterly spent. His hands were numb. His lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. He had nothing left. "It is clean," Osha said, her voice soft with what might have been satisfaction. She stood in the center of the circle, a lone figure in the immense, silent amphitheater of the dead. "Now," she said, her voice growing stronger, taking on a resonant, ceremonial tone. "Now you will bring the stones." "What stones?" he rasped, unable to move. "The hearthstones," she said, pointing out into the darkness of the ruins. Every hut had a hearth, the heart of the home, the stones that warmed the children and cooked the food, the stones that heard the laughter and the whispers. They remember everything. Go. Bring them. One from each foundation. The thought of moving again was an agony. But the command was in her voice, the weight of the ghosts was behind it. He dragged himself to his feet. His first steps were a drunken stagger. He looked out at the ruins, the dark, skeletal shapes. How many? 20? 30? It was another impossible task. He went to the nearest one, the hut where he had first seen her, the elder's hut. He stumbled through the doorway and found the collapsed remains of the central hearth. The stones were large, blackened by soot, cracked by the heat of the blaze that had destroyed the home. He bent down, his breath catching, and wrapped his arms around one. It was heavy, its surface rough and sharp. He strained, his muscles screaming, and managed to lift it. He carried it like a cross. Each step was a fresh torment. The stone dug into his chest, its weight compressing his already failing lungs. He gasped, he wheezed, he stumbled, but he did not fall. He carried the first hearthstone into the clean, dark circle and placed it where OSHA indicated, a few feet from the center. The moment it touched the ground, a new sensation filled the air. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. A feeling of presence, stronger than before. He looked at the stone, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw an old woman sitting beside it, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes kind. She looked at him, and he felt not judgment, but a deep, weary sorrow. Then she was gone. "That was Maeve," OSHA whispered. Her laugh sounded like falling pebbles. She told the stories of the beginning time. Braxton stared at the empty space where the woman had been, his heart pounding. He was not going mad. This was real. The ghosts were not just watching anymore. They were coming home. He turned and went for the next stone, and the next, and the next. The night became a pilgrimage of pain. Each journey out into the ruins was a descent into a specific hell of memory. With each stone he lifted, he felt a new presence join the circle. He brought the stone from the weaver's hut and smelled the phantom scent of lanolin and damp wool. He saw a flash of a woman's hands, nimble and swift, flying across a loom. Leon, he thought. No, Leon was the singer. This was another. Soraya, a voice whispered in his mind, a name like silk. He brought the stone from what must have been the tanner's hut, the air filling with the ghostly acrid smell of curing hides. A big man with powerful shoulders and a gentle face appeared for a heartbeat, his hands stained with dye. Taro, the man who had shielded his son. Braxton remembered him falling, a shield of his own body over a small boy. The boy. What had happened to the boy? He didn't dare ask OSHA. Some knowledge was too much to bear. He brought a stone from a small hut on the edge of the village and felt a wave of childish laughter, a sense of play and mischief. He saw two small boys chasing a dog, their faces bright with joy. With each stone, the circle filled, not with bodies, but with life. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with phantom smells, with the emotional residue of 100 lives. It was becoming a village again, a village of memories, and he, their destroyer, was its architect. He was rebuilding the world he had burned, one agonizing stone at a time. He lost track of how many he brought. 10, 15, 20. His body was screaming, a single sustained note of agony. He was running on something other than strength now, fueled by guilt and the strange, inexorable purpose OSHA had given him. He was a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead. He brought the last stone from the smallest, most remote foundation. It was small, light compared to the others. As he lifted it, he felt a wave of profound love and hope, the feeling of a young couple dreaming of the future, of the child they would raise within those walls. The feeling was so pure, so beautiful, it was the most painful of all. He cried out, a raw, animal sound of despair, and staggered back to the circle, the small stone clutched to his chest. He placed it in the last remaining spot. The circle of hearthstones was complete. Braxton fell to his knees in the center of it all, enclosed by the silent, waiting presences. He had done it. He had brought them all here. He looked up at OSHA, who stood like a priestess before her altar. "Now," he croaked. "Is it over now? Can I die now?" "The story is not over," she said, her voice ringing with a new power in the charged air of the circle. "The stones are here. The people are here." She looked at him, and her smoky eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. "Now you will light the fire. Not a fire of destruction, a fire of memory." She gestured to a pile of wood he hadn't noticed before, stacked neatly just outside the circle. It wasn't random kindling. It was specific: silver-barked birch, dark, heavy oak, and resinous pine. "Each wood remembers a different thing," she explained. Birch for beginnings, for the naming of children, oak for strength, for the agreements between men, pine for the stories, for the spirits of the forest. She handed him a flint and steel. His hands were so torn and clumsy he could barely hold them. "You, Braxton Hollow," she said, her voice resonating with the finality of a verdict. "You who brought the false fire of hatred, you will now bring the true fire of remembrance. Light it, in the center, and listen to what the smoke has to say." He knelt in the heart of the circle of stones, surrounded by the ghosts of the stone singers. He held the flint and steel in his bloody, shaking hands. He had come here for a quick death, for an end to the fire in his lungs. Instead, he was being asked to build a new one, a fire that promised not oblivion, but a reckoning more profound and terrible than any he could have imagined. He looked from the flint and steel to the pile of wood, then to the girl whose eyes held all the smoke of his past. He had no choice. He had to light it. The ghosts were waiting. They were all waiting. With a surge of desperate energy, Braxton struck the flint against the steel. A pathetic spark flew, dying instantly in the damp air. He tried again, his breath hitching, a cough building in his chest. Another feeble spark. He was failing. Even at this, he was failing. "Breathe," Osha said from the edge of the circle. Her voice was not commanding now, but quiet, almost gentle. "Breathe with the land, Braxton Hollow. Your fire is in your lungs. Share it." He didn't understand, but he was beyond questioning her. He closed his eyes, ignoring the pain, and focused on his breath. He drew in the cold, misty air of the valley, the air that felt thick with the presence of the dead. He held it, feeling the familiar, agonizing burn. And as he exhaled, a racking cough tore through him, and he struck the flint again. This time, a strong, bright spark leaped into the tinder she had prepared. It caught. A tiny orange eye opened in the darkness, blinked, and held. Tenderly, as if it were a newborn child, Braxton shielded it with his cupped hands, his own breath feeding it, nurturing it. He added a sliver of birch bark. The flame grew, a pale, clean fire that did not seem to give off any heat. He added the wood piece by piece, as she had instructed. First the birch, for new beginnings, then the oak, for strength and law. Finally the pine, for stories and spirits. The fire grew steadily, but it was a strange fire. It burned almost silently, with a low, humming sound, like a chorus of voices far away. The flames were not orange and yellow, but shifted through shades of silver, deep blue, and a soft, pearlescent white. It cast no flickering shadows. Instead, it illuminated the circle with a steady, serene light, making the hearthstones around him glow as if with their own internal warmth. And the smoke did not rise and dissipate. It coiled from the fire in a thick, purposeful column, a twisting pillar of gray and silver that held its shape in the still air. It did not smell of burning wood. It smelled of sage, of river mud, of baking bread, of rain on dry earth. "Watch," Osha commanded, her voice a whisper that carried over the hum of the fire. "Watch and listen." Braxton sat back on his haunches, his gaze fixed on the column of smoke. The ghosts, the presences he had felt, were drawn to it. The air grew dense, the impressions of the spirits becoming clearer, sharper. They were not figures of terror, but of profound sorrow and dignity. They gathered around the circle of stones, their former hearths, and watched the smoke with him. He saw the old storyteller, Maeve, her form clearer now, her eyes fixed on the fire as if reading a tale in its flames. He saw Taro, the protector, his broad hand resting on the shoulder of a translucent boy who shimmered beside him. He saw the weaver, Soraya, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. He saw them all, the faces of the people whose lives he had shattered. They were not looking at him with hatred. They were not looking at him at all. They were looking at the fire, at the smoke. They were here to remember themselves. And then, the smoke began to speak. Images formed in the coiling pillar, not like pictures on a screen, but like living memories given form. He saw the village as it had been. He saw children playing with polished stones by the creek. He saw Liane, her head thrown back, her song weaving itself into the fabric of the sunlight. He saw young men practicing with their ceremonial spears, their movements a dance of grace and strength. He saw women grinding corn, their conversation a low, happy murmur. He saw life, vibrant and whole, a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads of daily existence. The smoke shifted and the images changed. He saw the council fire, the real one, blazing in the circle. He saw Maeve telling a story, her voice a hypnotic cadence, her hands shaping the air. He saw the faces of her people, rapt, their shared history reflected in their eyes. He saw agreements being made, a handshake over a sacred pipe. He saw justice being meted out, not with punishment, but with reconciliation, with the mending of a torn community. He saw a culture so intricate and deeply rooted, it made the law and order of Marshal Thorne seem like the brutish scrawling of a child. Braxton watched, tears streaming down his face, unheeded. This was the world he had helped erase. Not a collection of savages on squatters' land, but a people, complete and whole, with a history as deep as the stones beneath him. The shame was a physical force, pressing him down, grinding him into the earth he had desecrated. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The fire held him, the smoke commanded his attention, and the ghosts demanded his witness. He was not just their killer, he was now their final archive, the unwilling vessel for their last story. The images in the smoke shifted again, growing darker. He saw the first riders on the ridge, small black figures against the setting sun. He saw the alarm spreading through the village, not as panic, but as a grave, solemn preparation. He saw the elders gathering the children, hiding them. He saw the men take up their stances, not for a battle they could win, but for a stand they had to make. They were not defending land. They were defending their soul. Then came the fire. His fire. The smoke in the center of the circle swirled, and he saw it all from their perspective. The terrifying roar of the flames, the alien faces of the deputies, twisted by firelight and hatred. He saw himself, a young man with a face pale with fear and misguided fervor, his torch held high. He saw the torch arc through the air as he threw it onto the roof of the weaver's hut. He saw the terror in Soraya's eyes just before the smoke consumed her. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a cry of pain. It was the sound of a soul breaking. He collapsed forward, his head hitting the cool earth, his body convulsing with sobs that were indistinguishable from his coughing. The fire hummed. The ghosts watched. Osha did not move. He lay there for an eternity, drowning in the memory of his sin. The fire of remembrance burned him cleaner and more terribly than any physical flame ever could. It burned away his excuses, his ignorance, his youth. It burned away everything but the raw, undeniable truth of what he had done. When the sobs finally subsided, leaving him a spent, shuddering wreck, he felt a small hand on his shoulder. He looked up. Osha was kneeling beside him. Her face was streaked with tears, her smoky eyes reflecting the holy fire. She was not just the keeper of the memory, she was a part of it. She had been watching her own world die, over and over again. "It is almost done," she whispered, her voice thick. The fire was beginning to die down. The pillar of smoke thinned, the images within it fading. The presences of the ghosts were becoming softer, their outlines blurring, as if they were receding, their story told. "Why?" Braxton croaked, the word a shard of glass in his throat. "Why make me see? Why not just kill me? Death is an escape. she said, her gaze profound. My people were not given an escape. They were given an end. You needed to see what was ended. She looked at the dying embers. A story is not finished until it is heard. A life is not over until it is remembered. Tonight, you were the ears. You were the heart that beat for them one last time. He understood then. This was not punishment in the way he knew it. It was not vengeance. It was something far older, far deeper. It was a restoration of balance. He had helped create a void, a silence. Tonight, he had been forced to fill that void with his own pain, his own witness. He had given the silence a voice, and in doing so had paid a debt far more intimate than blood for blood. The last of the fire died. The central ember glowed a dull red, then faded to black. The circle was plunged back into the pre-dawn darkness, lit only by the faint light of the stars. With the fire gone, the ghosts departed. The heavy presence in the air lifted, the phantom smells and sounds faded away, leaving behind only the profound, clean silence of the valley. It was not the dead, empty silence he had first encountered. It was a new silence, a silence of peace, of completion. The circle of hearthstones remained, a dark ring on the dark earth, each one a silent monument. Braxton lay on the ground, his breathing shallow, a faint wet rattle in his chest. The fire inside him was almost out. The labor, the sorrow, the terrible, beautiful visions in the smoke, they had taken the last of his strength. He was hollow, truly hollow now, but the gnawing guilt was gone. It had been replaced by a vast, aching sadness, a grief so large it had no room for self-pity. He felt Osha's hand on his forehead. It was cool. The sun is coming, she said softly. He could feel it, a slight lightening in the east, a promise of a new day he would not see. He was not afraid. The terror of death had been burned out of him. He had faced the ghosts of his past, and they had not destroyed him. They had unmade him, and in the unmaking, they had given him a strange and terrible kind of grace. Osha, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. I am here. The boy, Taro's son, the one he shielded. She was silent for a long moment. He felt her fingers tighten slightly on his brow. The fire did not take him, she said, her voice so low he could barely hear it. But the winter did. He did not know how to find the roots. He did not know the songs to keep the cold away. I was older. I remembered. The sorrow of it was a gentle weight, settling him, pressing him into the earth. Of course, the destruction was not just in the burning, it was in the breaking of the chain, the silencing of the knowledge. I'm sorry, he breathed. It was the first time he had said the words. He hadn't earned the right to say them before. Now, they felt true. Not an excuse, but a simple statement of his broken heart. She did not reply. She simply stayed with him, her hand a cool anchor in the fading world. He thought of the roan mare, probably grazing somewhere nearby, free now. He thought of the long ride here, the dust and the sun. He thought of the boy he had been, so full of terrible certainty. And he thought of the faces in the smoke, the life that had been. His last breath was not a cough. It was a quiet sigh of release. It left his body and mingled with the morning mist that was now rising from the valley floor. It drifted over the circle of stones, through the skeletal arms of the ruined huts, and was gone. The wind, for the first time, began to stir, a soft whisper through the dead grass, as if the land itself was finally breathing again. Osha stayed kneeling beside the body of Braxton Hollow as the sun rose, its pale gold light touching the tops of the distant mesas. She watched the light creep down into the valley, illuminating the circle of hearthstones, the clean-swept earth, the still form at its center. He looked smaller now, just a man, his face finally at peace. The spirits of her people were gone, their story told, their memory honored. They were at rest in the quiet earth. The silence was hers again, but it was no longer a silence of grief. It was a silence of stewardship. She rose, her small form casting a long shadow in the morning light. She looked out over the valley, her home. It was a ghost village no longer. It was a graveyard, a sacred place, a monument of stone and memory. Her work was done. The wound had been cleansed. The story had been told. The fire had been lit, and in its ashes, something new and quiet and resilient had been born. She turned and walked toward the spring to fetch the morning's water, her bare feet leaving the first new prints on the damp, waiting earth.